Hello, Dinuba Presbyterian Church, and welcome back to our online video Bible study series on the life and writings of the Apostle Paul. Thank you very much to all of you for your prayers and your support and your expressions of love to myself and Pastor Chelsea over these last couple of weeks as we have been battling coronavirus. We both tested positive for COVID-19 and we both did experience that illness. Fortunately, both of our cases were very mild, and so we have come out of the end of our self-isolation and we're ready to get back into the world and get back into the swing of things. But thank you very much for all of your support and again, your prayers during that time. We really do appreciate all of you, and we love you all very much and look forward to seeing you soon. So it's time to jump back in. Last week we began a new series of studies on the Apostle Paul and the many books of the New Testament that he wrote by asking ourselves some fundamental questions about why he is worth studying. But having kind of set the table with that discussion, it's time this week to dig in and begin constructing a biography of the man known as Saul of Tarsus. Constructing this biographical sketch will take us 2 weeks to complete, so we're using his famous conversion experience on the road to Damascus as the dividing line between this week and next week. So for today, we're looking at the life of Paul from his birth all the way up to his conversion. Paul never wrote an autobiography, unfortunately, so to piece together a solid picture of his life, we'll have to do some careful work with the New Testament record, including the epistles and, of course, the book of Acts, the general history of the ancient Near East, from which we can make some assumptions, and, of course, we can use church tradition as well. Church tradition will be particularly helpful as we treat the end of Paul's life next week. Beyond that, the actual historical record about the Apostle Paul is fairly scant, and the Bible doesn't give us a whole lot to go on. In addition to the book of Acts, we can glean some information directly from passages of his letter to the Galatians, and some information indirectly from the last chapter of Romans, chapter 16, where Paul offers an extensive list of friends and family relations that he wishes to greet. But apart from these ancient sources, which are now a part of the Bible, there are several historically dubious ancient sources that purport to tell us something about Paul. The most interesting is a 2nd century text called the Acts of Paul and Thecla, which was penned by an unknown party, apparently in church leadership. It's been described as a sort of theological romance, as a young and pious woman named Thecla receives copies of Paul's writings and becomes unusually devoted to them. She decides to follow in Paul's footsteps and travel throughout the ancient world, proclaiming the gospel. And along the way, she stumbles upon a previously unknown teaching of Paul that mandates abstinence even in marriage. Because of this kind of shocking and very unbiblical claim, the ancient church fathers Tertullian and Jerome condemned this text as heretical in the 2nd and 4th centuries, respectively. But among the text's controversial content is a physical description of the Apostle Paul, which is not very flattering. They say, a man of middling size, and his hair was scanty, and his legs were a little crooked, and his knees were far apart. He had large eyes, and his eyebrows met, and his nose was somewhat long. So, if we are to take this physical description of Paul from the Acts of Paul and Thecla seriously, Paul has a unibrow. Perhaps he took after the Lord Jesus and that there was nothing particularly attractive or majestic about him that would make us take notice of him. But at any rate, in an entirely absence of any evidence to the contrary, we can deduce that the Apostle Paul was similar to me, unathletic and no future in male modeling. The Apostle Paul was clearly going to get by in life based on his intelligence and his education. So that said, let's start creating a timeline of Paul's life. To begin, we go all the way back to the year 67 BC. You might recall this period of time from one of our earlier studies all the way back in August of last year. Judea has been engulfed in civil war ever since the death of Queen Salome of the Hasmonean dynasty. Her 2 sons, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, are at war with each other to determine who is going to take Mom's old job. Eventually, Aristobulus will decide that he cannot be victorious without foreign assistance, and 4 years down the line, he will reach out to the Roman general Pompey the Great and ask him to enter the war on his side, a fateful decision which is the beginning of Roman rule over the Jewish people. But for now, in 67 BC, Pompey is busy defeating piracy in Asia Minor. And as a part of this campaign, he conquers a city called Tarsus, declaring it the capital of the new Roman province of Cilicia. Tarsus is an ancient city, even at this time, with a proud tradition of self-rule and independence. Pompey was wise to make Tarsus a Roman capital, given its strategic location as a nexus between trading routes on the sea and overland, and its rich agricultural industry. But under the administration of the Roman Empire, Tarsus becomes known as an intellectual center, sporting an academy that educated Caesar Augustus himself. Such prominent clientele promised lucrative Roman patronage to the city. And by the beginning of the 1st century, near the time when Jesus was born and the time when Paul was born, Tarsus is in Roman political ascendancy. Yet the city is still considered free, that is, self-governing, though under Roman supervision as a part of the deal Pompey struck when he conquered it. Our next stop is somewhere between 5 and 6 AD. Somewhere in this range of time is when we believe that the Apostle Paul was born in this Roman intellectual metropolis of Tarsus. We don't know the birth order in his family, but we do know that Paul had at least one sibling, a sister. His parents gave him the Jewish name Saul, very likely as a reference to the first king of Israel, who was among the most famous individuals in their family tribe of Benjamin. Now, we usually assume that Saul of Tarsus took on the name Paul sometime after his conversion on the road to Damascus, as a way of making that major shift in his life more evident, as a way of marking that experience in his life. But that's probably not true. It was very common for Hellenistic Jews living in Roman colonies to have two names, one for each of the two cultures in which they lived, a Jewish name and a Roman name. From birth, the apostles to the Gentiles very likely went by Saul among the Jews and by Paul among the Gentile Romans. From early in his childhood, he was being prepared to be an ambassador between these two groups. The young Paul had other connections to Roman culture beyond just his Roman name. He was also a Roman citizen by birth, as we learned during the events described in Acts chapter 21 and 22. Roman citizenship was originally only available to actual citizens of the city of Rome itself. But as the Roman Republic, and later the Roman Empire, expanded, the need to incorporate new citizens from the new lands that were being conquered was recognized. For those outside the Eternal City, citizenship could be acquired in one of three ways. You could serve in the Roman army and survive for 25 years and then be declared a citizen. You could pay an exorbitant amount of money and buy your citizenship. Or you could be born to the right people in the right place. The children of the upper crust of Roman society born outside Rome, and those born in free cities, such as Tarsus, where Paul was born, were automatically granted citizenship in the empire. Outside of certain legal protections, Roman citizenship offered very few benefits if you weren't living in the capital city, since all voting by the citizenry had to be conducted in person in Rome. But Paul's legal status and his rights of appeal would bring him into the halls of the most powerful people on earth in his time. Despite these connections to Roman society, the young Saul of Tarsus remained very much in touch with his Jewish heritage, and in fact, his Jewish roots and faith in the God of Israel were so important to him that when he was about 13 years of age, he left Tarsus and traveled to Jerusalem. His goal was to become a Pharisee. It's not clear if Paul directly witnessed any of the events in Jerusalem related to Jesus' life, or if he ever saw Jesus in person before the crucifixion. But given the trajectory of the next several years of Paul's life, this actually seems very likely. Our next stop in our timeline is between the years 20 and 33 AD. In Galatians chapter 1, Paul begins to describe his former life before the road to Damascus and his encounter with the risen Jesus. He says that as a young man, he was extremely zealous for the traditions of his fathers. and boasts that he advanced in Judaism far faster than most people his age, owing to his dedication and his acumen. He's referring here to his training as a Pharisee, which was no small accomplishment. I think it's worth taking a moment to remind ourselves who the Pharisees were. Their name means the separated ones, and in the first century, they represented one of four major divisions within Judaism that were debating how best to respond to Roman rule over the Jewish people. We studied these divisions at the end of last summer, and the Pharisees disagreed with the approaches taken by the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots. The Pharisees believed that the best response to the problem of Roman rule was to continue following the Mosaic law so scrupulously, so fully, and make the nation so righteous that God would have no choice but to honor their obedience by driving the Romans out and restoring them to self-rule in their land. Strict adherence to the law and to the extra traditions that the Pharisees created was critically important in the Pharisees' view, and they offered both solicited and sometimes unsolicited advice to the Jewish people about how well they were observing the Mosaic precepts. The Pharisees actually enjoyed a great deal of popularity with the people, at least compared to the elitist and remote Sadducees, and the eccentric Essenes, and the violent Zealots. Consequently, the Pharisees drew most of their new recruits from the middle classes and families of tradespeople. Paul's family was probably somewhere in the middle to the upper echelon of the merchant class. Pharisaical society was organized into various community cells called habara, and the cell into which the young Paul entered was the same cell as that of an older, highly respected teacher of the law named Gamaliel. This is likely the same Gamaliel that we have met before in our studies together, if you remember the Sanhedrin's discussions in Acts chapter 5 about waiting to see if this new movement of Jesus' followers was from God or if it would burn itself out. Paul would not have been considered a full-fledged Pharisee immediately upon his arrival in Jerusalem. There was a process of admission to become an official Pharisee. First, Paul underwent an intensive year of scrutiny where the community assesses if the young man was really serious about following all of the law and all of the tradition, from moral obligations to dietary laws, even to tithing. At the end of the year, Paul was found blameless by their standards, and he was recognized as a full Pharisee. After that, he would have engaged in what were essentially evangelistic missionary journeys around the Hellenized world, preaching Pharisaic respect and observance of the law to Jews outside of Judea, an experience that honed Paul's fearless, enterprising impulse to travel and present the truth of God as he understood it. Each Pharisaical community was led by a scribe, a trained authority in law. And though Paul was trained by the scribe Gamaliel, the elder teacher's leniency toward the Christian faith that we see in Acts chapter 5 did not rub off on his pupil at all. He did not share Gamaliel's more circumspect position that the matter of Jesus' followers must be waited out to see if it was truly a matter of God or if it was simply another case of a people's hero quickly crushed and quickly forgotten. For Saul of Tarsus, who had devoted both his adolescent and his adult life to the careful study of the Scriptures and the meticulous observation of the law, the rise of Jesus' disciples in the wake of his death was an existential threat to the character, the identity, and the spiritual integrity of the Jewish people, all of which the Pharisees were committed to protecting. To make matters worse, the man that they elevated as the Christ had openly rebuked the Pharisees throughout his ministry, and very directly during his last week in Jerusalem before his death. I think it's safe to speculate that the sudden and dramatic growth of the church in Jerusalem immediately after Pentecost, with thousands hearing Peter's message and believing that Jesus was the Messiah in accordance with the prophecies of the Old Testament, rattled Paul very deeply. It shook him to his core. This was an explosive and swift movement, adding thousands to its numbers every day as its adherents gathered and preached at the temple, Jerusalem's holiest site. There simply wasn't time to wait, as Gamaliel had suggested. Paul wanted to take action, and he did. He became obsessed with rooting out and obliterating this movement before it could gain any more traction or spread any further. And eventually the Jewish religious establishment in Jerusalem sanctioned Paul's mission and his methodology, as we read at the beginning of Acts chapter 9. His campaign against the church was like something out of a best-selling thriller or a stirring tale of espionage. We can glean from Paul's discussion of his experiences in Acts 22 that one of his tactics was to enlist false brothers to claim that they were believers in Jesus so they could gain acceptance into the early Christian community. Once they learned who the followers of the way were, they would betray them to the temple authorities and have them arrested. Similarly, Paul would also employ professional agitators to begin spreading rumors and false accusations of blasphemy by Christians against the law of Moses, a charge that resulted in arrest and, in many cases, people being stoned to death, as is the case with Stephen, the most famous martyr in Acts chapter 7. And Luke records that Paul witnessed an active and authoritative approval as the mob killed Stephen. Luke also notes that Paul paid no mind to who was a part of the communities he attacked. Both men and women were arrested and imprisoned, both the young and the old. It seems nothing could sway Paul from his brutal mission to exterminate the way. The wisdom of his mentor could not. The spirit-filled testimony of Stephen and Stephen's angelic appearance at his death could not. And apparently even Paul's family could not. It's possible to interpret Romans chapter 16, verse 7, to say that members of Paul's own family had come to faith in Jesus before Paul's experience on the road to Damascus. This part of Romans is a very long collection of greetings that Paul is sending to believers in and around Rome. Paul mentions 30 different people in this chapter, but 6 of these people he refers to as, quote, his kinsmen. The Greek term in use here is used almost exclusively to refer to one's blood relatives, that is, actual familial relations within just a few generations. 2 of these kinsmen Paul mentions are Andronicus and Junia, both of whom Paul says were, quote, in Christ before I was. They came to faith while Paul was still seeking to destroy that faith. I can't imagine what kind of pressure this must have created in Paul's mind and his heart. Perhaps it only fueled his anger and his sense of righteous fury as he heard of his own relatives falling prey to a dangerous heresy. Perhaps it added inexpressible weight to the guilt Paul must have felt later in his life, since he had put his own family in danger of being killed. This is all speculation, of course, but I think it's safe to say that God was already working in and around Paul's life before Jesus met him on the Damascus Road. Paul was a unique individual, steeped in Roman culture, but thoroughly, committedly, indisputably Jewish, dedicated to the law of Moses, and an expert on the scriptures. Even before his conversion, Paul stood as a figure astride 2 distinct, sometimes contradictory worlds, and God was orchestrating his life to become a bridge between them and to bring the gospel of Jesus to the Gentiles. So next week, we're going to pick up at the road to Damascus and see how God directs the second half of the extraordinary life of the Apostle Paul before we begin to survey all of the books of the New Testament that he would go on to write in the coming weeks. I hope you'll join us then, but until then, the Lord bless you this week, and we'll see you next time.